The siren did not wail so much as saw the air into strips, a ragged-toothed warning that returned in waves down the ruined street. In the cellar beneath a cracked archway off Via dei Tribunali, 4:17 a.m., 4th December 1943, a young Italian woman pressed her palms into tile glazed with old soot and fresh dust. Two Americans in steel pots ducked through the doorway, boots skidding on grit, flashlights carving clean cones in the murk. PFC Hyman Huberman had an M1 carbine slung, magazine out and safety on. PFC Sidney Bukowski carried an MP's canvas first aid packet, iodine ampule ticking against a safety pin. "We're here," Huberman said in the slow English he used with his Brooklyn customers' grandmothers, and though the mother did not speak the words, she understood the voice. Above them, a detonation thumped, distant, then closer, shaking loose curls of plaster like paper ash. From somewhere beyond the mouth of the shelter came the steady animal thrum of an engine idling 2 streets away, a Dodge WC-54 ambulance holding its breath. Bukowski boiled a rag in a dented pot someone produced from a corner, steam ghosting up past his knuckles. Huberman shrugged off his web belt, wiped his hands with iodine, then knelt, the brim of his helmet scraping brick as he leaned to catch what he did not yet dare name. The woman's breath ran in harsh ropes, then steadied as an older voice, nonna, commanding and kind, counted in Italian, tapping a tin crucifix against the wall like a metronome. The air smelled of coal, sweat, disinfectant, and a wet mineral metallicity that always lives where stone meets fear. The siren died. In the hush, the men could hear the harbour, a long, patient set of engines turning over beyond the bombed moles, machinery that would not stop for weather, noise, or memory. Now, Bianchi would later explain, was a narrow window, labour like a battle, advances and withdrawals measured in inches. But in that cellar, it was only hands and courage. Huberman coached the breathing he barely believed in, surprised at the certainty tucked into his own throat. Bukowski steadied the flashlight, shoulders pressed into damp brick, chuckling under his breath to keep the room from shattering. The baby crowned as outside some big marine motor rose, dipped and rose again, like a heartbeat refusing to be argued with. When the child slipped into Huberman's palms, slick, astonishing, louder than the war for a single second, he looped a torn strip of his MP armband to tie the cloth they had warmed. He looked up at the mother, who stared with a gratitude so frank it felt like a salute. "Americani," she whispered, then, searching for the word she wanted, "buoni." Above them the old arch shuddered and settled. Bukowski grinned, half sheepish, half victorious, and the engine outside found a new rhythm, as if taking the infant's measure. The siren would return, the war would keep its appointments. But the first cry cut clean through December, carrying toward the harbour, where a different kind of power was already at work. Maps explain what streets refused to. Pins and threads suggested Naples had liberated itself in 4 days, 27th to 30th September 1943, then opened for Allied entry on 1st October. The walk tells another story. Pipes burst on purpose by disciplined retreat, cranes laid down like tall animals shot on the run, the harbour thick with scuttled hulls that made a steel archipelago out of the inner basin. The city inhaled smoke and wondered what breath felt like. Into that stunned pause came checklists and clipboards, the peninsula base section stitching an operating plan across a patient with a stubborn pulse. Engineers named broken things and then fixed them. Medical officers requisitioned schools and fairgrounds, chalked ward rosters on blackboards still ghosted with Latin verbs. Lieutenant Maria Bianchi, who had been a Red Cross volunteer before the occupation turned such labels to ash, found herself drafted into the 118th Station Hospital when it opened on the 14th of October, quickly joined by the 106th Station on the 17th, then others in November. She translated symptoms into triage, fear into routine. "You," she would say to a mother whose child burned at the temples, "stand here, Powder first, then the doctor. She learned the cadence of American medical English the way a soldier learns range tables, dosage like doctrine, sanitation like security. Outside the gates, military police directed convoys with practiced heaves of the hand, clearing choke points, ticketing blackout violators with bored precision that hid their relief at doing anything other than killing. At the waterfront, Captain Robert Bobby Ames rode a GMC Duke KW 353 as if it were a mule that loved salt water, clipboard strapped to his thigh. Portable cranes arrived in pieces and were reimagined from scavenged booms and repurposed derricks. The first numbers were not elegant. They were enough. 2 weeks after liberation, the port moved around 3,500 tons a day. By late October, stubborn and wet and humming with work, it rose towards 7,000 tons daily, a near pre-war rate reached within weeks rather than months. Around 600 ducks, as everyone called them, churned in cycles, ship to shore to depot to ship again, their screws throwing rooster tails that lacquered everything with brine. Bianchi caught rumours in the line, old women calling the shelter dwellers prisoners, youths repeating that the Americans would send them all to camps up north. She corrected the language gently, not to win an argument but to make the clinics run. The men with clipboards did not look like conquerors. They looked like mechanics with jurisdiction. Steam rose from the drains. Oil left rainbows in puddles. Winter nosed down from the Volturno and found canvas tents holding heat because somebody had written a requisition in time. The city was a hospital, a dockyard, a barracks, a promise. Out in the roads, an MP jeep idled, top down, radio scratching. It would be needed at first light. North of the city, in a tired farmhouse converted for signals work, Obergefreiter Karl Weiss leaned over a field table and made columns stand at attention. Grease pencil on acetate, stub pencil in a notebook, he listened to traffic that was not secret so much as relentless. Convoy counts, hospital bed activations, delousing station schedules. Soft targets not worth bombs, his captain liked to say, meaning not honourable. Weiss suspected honour had little to do with it. He plotted Allied port throughput, 3,500 tons per day 2 weeks after entry, trending upward toward roughly 7,000 within a month. He sketched a second line for Luftwaffe sorties that did not rise to meet it. The curves refused to intersect. He copied figures that sounded like boasts but kept appearing from different nets. Duke KWs in theatre approaching 600 at the waterfront alone, with roughly 21,000 manufactured stateside, WC-54 ambulances built in numbers beyond 26,000, jeeps, a word that seemed like a joke at first, numbering towards 647,000 across the war. None of these numbers were a gun, but each of them made guns count. An impossible line item in Weiss's private margin. One harbour clawed from wreckage delivering near pre-war tonnage within weeks, while his own army rationed fuel by regiment and counted tyres like jewellery. He underlined it twice, then added a third underline when a report crossed his set about delousing lines planned for hundreds of thousands of civilians, a public health offensive as large as a corps movement and less vulnerable to weather. The wind rattled the shutters. The Volturno, Weiss knew, would be up with the rain, ponton bridges groaning under loads they were never meant to carry. In such weather, American traffic control, those MPs who waved like indifferent gods, would matter as much as artillery. He thought of the old textbooks at signals school, the clean diagrams of attack and defence, the tidy expectation that damage removed capacity, and therefore time. Here damage had become friction, and the enemy had purchased grease in bulk. Down in Naples, in a cellar Weiss would never see, a baby had been born that morning. The act would be retold as an anecdote, captioned with a grin, a morale piece for newspapers. But the arithmetic nested inside it kept Weiss awake. 2 privates become midwives because the system that fed them valued a mother's health. The same system delivered plasma by the crate and diesel by the cask, and it kept its books better than his staff kept their maps. He pulled a line through his busiest chart and wrote in careful script beside it, "Nicht zu stoppen." Then he capped his pencil and listened to the net breathe. The harbour smelled of hot rope and cold iron, old oil lifting rainbow skin off puddles the colour of night. Captain Ames stood at the edge of a broken quay that had once been a statement of imperial confidence and was now a museum of wreckage. A Liberty ship exhaled somewhere beyond the scuttled hulks, long and patient, while the first DUKW of the morning nosed shoreward like a seal. The duck's bow ladder clanged as a stevedore hopped down and skittered across slime-dark stone, hands already reaching for the slung cargo net that swung like an enormous cradle. The load sheet read plasma, tinned milk, water cans, artillery fuses, a babel of needs in one lift. Ames checked his cycle times, then checked them again. Ducks from ship to beach, trucks from beach to transit depot, rail from depot inland. Where cranes lay on their sides like felled giraffes, engineers lashed portable derricks together from survivors. The numbers had the clean vanity of a solved equation, £5,000 per duck, repetition beating elegance every time. What should have taken months had been forced into weeks by bright desperation and expertise practiced in American ports, where unions taught rhythm as surely as the army taught drill. The port moved toward 7,000 tons a day, a phrase that belonged in a ledger until you felt its implications at the front, where an infantry regiment discovered its rations arrived on schedule despite a month of rain. In the alleys above, Bianchi walked a line of mothers past a delousing station that hissed like 1,000 cats. She explained each step in the soft authority of someone too tired to lie. Powder, then doctor, then soup. A rumour flared and vanished in the same breath, someone's cousin insisting the Americans would ship the women off in trains, because routine, repeated, is the enemy of fear. An MP jeep idled by the clinic gate, radio netting the city to the harbour in a web that did not care for ideology. A duck came up out of the water streaming lakelets that mirrored the sky. Its driver, cap reversed under his helmet, raised 2 fingers to Ames without looking, and rolled on. The portable crane creaked, took the next net, obeyed. The engine notes mixed with gulls, with the snap of wet rope, with the long wheeze of a ship's winch placing its faith on shore. Somewhere behind the ridge of buildings, sirens would begin their habit again. Ames tightened his chin strap, marked down another completed cycle, and told the foreman to send the next duck. The morning had that conspiratorial air familiar to anyone who has ever made a broken thing work harder than it should. The courtyard carried a light dusting, as if a tame snow had wandered in off the Gulf, granular and faintly sweet, catching in hair and cuffs. The atomizers hissed without drama, hands practiced on the squeeze. White DDT puffed into collars and along belt lines, sifted into seams where lice made their stubborn encampments. Bianchi moved the queue with a schoolteacher's kindness and a nurse's impatience. "Avanti," she said, then in a careful echo of the Americans, "Next." Children giggled at the novelty until the powder tickled their noses and they sneezed like soldiers in a gas drill. Mothers endured with the weary pride of people used to necessity. The routine would have seemed bureaucratic if not for the stakes scrawled in ink. Typhus here, here, and here last week, admissions spiking in the quarter behind the burned-out tram depot. Now the line curved in on itself, an Ouroboros of prevention, and the clinic's ledger began to show what every medic wanted: fewer fevers, fewer rashes, fewer beds lost to disease that respected neither patriotism nor rumour. Outside the gate, PFC Huberman flagged a WC-54 ambulance through the knot of pushcarts, its long hood shining like a polite alligator. He checked his watch, synchronized with the hospital's radio net, and waved forward a civilian flatbed hauling water cans that would be refilled twice before noon. The smell of the courtyard was its own science: disinfectant and dust, iodine and steam, a trace of coffee from the annex where volunteers ladled soup into tin cups dented along their histories. A runt of a boy, too thin even now, raised a chocolate square like a medal and saluted the MP in the way kids imitate authority, earnest and inaccurate. Huberman grinned and returned something that would pass for a salute if no sergeant were watching. A British corporal, off-duty and curious, watched the line and said softly, "That'll do it, that will," then shrugged when Bianchi smiled at him as if they shared a private joke called survival. The ledger on Bianchi's desk began to collect its own poetry. Numbers stacked neatly, dozens processed into hundreds, hundreds promising thousands. The effect would not be news, which prefers explosions to calibrations, but it would be decisive. In the harbour, the ducks kept their dull glory going, bringing in the kits that made the powder and the plasma and the patients possible. Huberman climbed into the ambulance for the next circuit, radio crackling with street names and cautions. As the driver eased out, the boy with the chocolate stuck his tongue out to taste the air and made a face that suggested the powder had opinions. The line moved. So did the city. Weiss drew a final overlay and stepped back as if distance might change the geometry. It did not. Allied tonnage at Naples, those stubborn figures he had been tracing for weeks, rose like a tide you could set your watch by, cresting toward roughly 7,000 tons per day within weeks of entry, despite deliberate demolitions that ought to have disemboweled the port for a season. Luftwaffe sorties against the city and approaches stayed roughly flat, fuel rationing turning plans into polite requests. He measured the gap between the lines and felt the emptiness in it like altitude. He briefed his captain with the humility of a man who understands he is bringing weather, not options. The enemy had 600 or so amphibious trucks at the waterfront alone, DUKW 353S cycling cargo regardless of pier condition, underwritten by a homeland that had produced roughly 21,000 of the beasts. Ambulances built beyond 26,000, jeeps manufactured at a peacetime accountant's nightmare scale towards 647,000 across the war, wired the city to its hinterland so completely that traffic control became a combat multiplier. Delousing lines processed civilians by the 100,000, suppressing typhus and returning labour to the docks. The captain rubbed his eyes and said, "We will do more, with less." A pep talk that had lost both words to repetition. Weiss returned to his table and wrote a line in his diary he knew he would never speak in a briefing. Not beaten by tanks, beaten by everything. He listed the small humiliations that made the sentence true. An American MP waving a convoy through a knot that would have delayed them an hour, a nurse with bilingual patients turning panic into compliance, a portable crane made from scrap lifting a net that contained a dozen kinds of salvation. He did not write about the cellar in Naples because he did not know it, but he had a sense of its shape. A human moment subsidized by a system that did not brag because it did not need to. Every third page of his notebook held what he privately called the impossible statistic, the sort that would have sounded like propaganda if it had not arrived as cargo. A single broken harbour restored within weeks to near pre-war throughput. A single class of amphibious truck built in numbers that, on paper, exceeded the entire Axis family of comparable machines. A single American factory costed to produce a Jeep for roughly $738.74, less than a good officer's boots, repeated so often that scarcity itself seemed a defeated doctrine. Orders came down to shift demolitions farther north. Naples, the captain said, was lost time. Weiss folded the acetate graph, slid it into his map case, and listened to the net as if it were breathing in the next move. The light went lavender first, then charcoal, as if the city preferred to enter night by negotiation. Headlights hooded with blackout slits stitched a faint silver down Via Foria, while an MP whistle peeped twice, and the file obeyed like a drilled platoon. Huberman stood at the choke point with one palm high, the other at his hip, a conductor drawing order out of rubble. The first WC-54 eased by with the gentle arrogance of a machine that knew its purpose. The driver lifted two fingers. In the back, canvas snapped in the cool air, and a corpsman murmured to a soldier whose bandage had the clean geometry of recent work. Behind them, a civilian flatbed rattled water cans toward the hospital annex where steam curled into the dusk. Bianchi stepped from the gate with the resolve of a junior officer who answers to outcomes more than ranks. "You come tomorrow," she told a mother who nodded too quickly, eyes on the infant against her chest. The clinic's ledger, stamped and scuffed, already showed fewer fevers this week, fewer admissions for the rash that had stalked the alleys near the tram depot. The delousing tables ran quiet and steady. Atomizers hissed in rhythm. The courtyard's white dust had become part of the city's furniture, like laundry lines and saints in niches. A duck groaned ashore a few streets away. Sound travels without invitations in a port city, and Huberman felt the vibration in the soles of his boots. The net slung from its bow would hold anything that fit: plasma tins, split rivets, field telephones, and, tonight, a crate of formula that Bianchi had petitioned for with a patient ferocity Ames admired. The harbour and the clinic had learned each other's names. The radio net knotted them close. In the half-light, Huberman recognised the shelter mother, hair pinned up now, steps surer. She said the baby's name, Libera, free, and laughed at his careful pronunciation. Berkowski, leaning on the jeep, made show of marking her on a roster of VIPS, which in his book meant anybody who had taught him a word he would not forget. The convoy rolled again: ambulance, water, rations, then an engineer truck with cables slung like sleeping snakes. Blackout curtains stirred in blasted windows as the procession breathed past. Weiss, north of the city, would have labelled it a phenomenon beyond interdiction. In the street it looked like competence wrapped in canvas. Huberman lifted his whistle, gave the two-note call, and felt the small, immodest pride that comes when moving parts align. He thought of the armband strip tied around a newborn in a cellar, a ribbon he had not yet replaced, and decided to leave it frayed a little longer. The harbour lay out there in the dark, too busy for sleep, the city between them humming like a great transfusion. Rain came straight and narrow, a disciplined fall that polished the keystones to a dull shine. Ames wore his helmet low and his clipboard high, the posture of a man who lived between elements. A Liberty ship's winch sighed, metal on metal, and the cargo net tilted to show its confidences. Shell fuses in neat tins, bandage rolls that smelled like cotton's memory, crate stencilled milk evap. A duck idled alongside with the patience of a draft horse, then took the load and shouldered into the chop without bothering the ruined pier at all. Where cranes had been skeletal complaints against the sky, patched derricks now pawed the air like animals trying to rise. Cycle times, the gospel of a port, had flattened into a rhythm that could be planned against. Ducks from ship to transit beach in minutes, trucks from beach to depot in fractions of an hour, rail from depot inland in predictable blocks that let Fifth Army staff write timetables that survived contact with weather. A foreman handed Ames a greasy sheet that said the quiet part aloud. Today's discharge rates would outpace yesterday's by a margin that seemed small until you counted days like infantry counts yards. Then someone mentioned what everyone felt but nobody wanted to jinx. The day's tally might nose past pre-war average if the wind held. Bianchi's requisitions rode within those numbers, a private river in a public flood. The clinic shelves stayed stocked not by miracle, but by men with pencils who understood that maternal was a line item as decisive as ordnance. When a request for more infant formula reached Ames's pocket, he marked it urgent with the same pencil that circled artillery loads, because the same logic applied. Healthy workers moved crates faster. Healthy babies kept mothers in line and out of panic. A city that trusted the hand with the clipboards did not spit in the soup. Up the coast, Weiss heard about a bridge washed thin as a violin string and waited for the Allied tempo to falter. It did not. Ponton units made repairs with the cheerful fatalism of men who did not take rain personally, and the ducks simply ignored the argument by going around it. The impossible feeling, reflected later in his diary, was not that the enemy built too much, but that they built enough of everything at the same time. The harbour breathed, the city breathed with it, the front drew breath it did not have to borrow. Ames logged the last tonnage, circled it twice, and allowed himself a smile that was mostly relief. "Faster tomorrow," he said to nobody in particular, and the rain agreed by saying nothing. The Volturno ran high enough to make the bridge crews curse by rank, a grey-brown mussel of water that slapped ponton sides with a sound like open hands. Medics bent against the weather, boots skating on duckboards, litters passing shoulder to shoulder under a sky that could not decide between rain and commitment. A flare hung like a false moon over the far bank and turned tarps into quicksilver. The first WC-54 of the run nosed down the approach, engine confident, tyres humming a note that meant the carburetor had listened to the morning's tune-up. Huberman's unit had the road cordoned off with wire and respect, MP's palms flicking traffic into compliance with the grace of habit. Ames had warned the staff that evacuation times would stretch. They did, but not to breaking. The hospital annex in Naples had opened extra beds at Bianchi's insistence, plasma lockers cold and ready, delousing lines calm even in rain so that the men hauling lines and driving trucks did not collapse into fever next week. Weiss received the weather reports and waited for math to assert itself. It did, but not his math. Amphibious lift made the river a suggestion rather than a verdict. A duck carried supplies around a washed shoulder of road with the indifference of an animal used to both elements. The rail yard took the overflow when the highway balked, and the ledger at the port kept climbing like a heartbeat refusing despair. The impossible statistic, which Weiss wrote down and then underlined in exasperated respect, was not a single number but a tempo. A shattered harbour restored within weeks to near pre-war throughput. Amphibious trucks built by the tens of thousands. Ambulances and jeeps produced in floods, and crucially, a delousing campaign that processed civilians by the 100,000, so dock labour stayed on the job. The bridge crews fought water. The system ignored the fight by multiplying paths. The Germans had courage, doctrine and guns. The Americans had all that plus redundancy, which in a storm is a more reliable ally than genius. On the quay, duck drivers joked that their rigs were part fish. On the road, ambulance drivers said their vehicles had the manners of a good dog. In the ward, Bianchi breathed through a procedure with a mother who had learned to trust her in 3 visits and a bar of soap. Huberman rode shotgun on the return trip into Naples, the wiper's metronome counting seconds he preferred not to measure. At a stoplight that no longer worked, his whistle found the old 2-note command, and the city answered. The Volturno would drop eventually. Tonight, it had to be endured. The convoy's lights, thin as patience, stitched the darkness closed behind them. A long table and a stack of carbons can tell a story so blunt it feels like prophecy. The requisition forms had their boxy humour, quantity, item, justification. But the totals, once set side by side, read like a campaign map. DUKW 353 amphibious trucks, roughly 21,000 produced, with about 600 cycling at Naples alone. WC 54 ambulances, more than 26,000 built, 4 litters when needed, quick enough to make time irrelevant between gate and ward. Jeeps, Willys MB and Ford GPW, approaching 647,000 across the war, which meant every problem had a small engine and 4 wheels on call. M1 Garans arriving by trainload from Springfield and Winchester, their serial numbers advancing like a metronome. Naples throughput inked near 7,000 tons per day within weeks of entry, a figure that made planners expand their horizons and skeptics find new denominations for disbelief. Station hospitals opened with a tempo one would call aggressive if it hadn't been necessary. 118 on 14th October, 106th 3 days later, then others, until the city's map looked like a medical textbook collaged onto a gazetteer. Public health lines processed civilians by the 100,000, a doctrine of prevention that looked soft until it hardened into more shifts on the docks and fewer bodies in beds. The ledger did not claim heroism. It merely told you what was possible if you refused to choose between compassion and efficiency. In one corner of the table, a note corrected a rumour that had been too convenient to kill. The women at clinics were civilians under Allied administration, not prisoners of war. The mislabel persisted in alleys and, later, in memories, because captivity is easier to dramatise than stewardship. Bianchi, reading the note, smiled without humour and wrote her own correction in the margin. Healthy mother, healthy city, healthy front. Elsewhere, Ames circled cycle times, underlined railcar turns per shift, and put neat ticks beside shipments of formula that had arrived because somebody treated the word maternal as operational. Weiss would have recognised the logic if not the allegiance. Mercy was a multiplier, a force that made other forces worth their fuel. The Americans had mastered the unpopular truth that logistics is love with a ledger, and they practiced it until it looked like weather. At the chapter's end, the numbers arranged themselves into a single noun that soldiers trust when slogans fail: advantage. Outside the office, gulls argued over a length of rope that had forgotten its ship. In the ward, a baby slept as if victory were a blanket. The clerk blotted the last total and closed the book with the careful satisfaction of a craftsman. Weiss packed with the obedience of a man who understands that orders cure thought. The acetate overlays went first, edges grey with use, then the notebook with its careful insults to fate. Last, the stub pencils that had turned numbers into a habit. The move north came with the usual flavours of regret. We are leaving too early. We are leaving too late. We are leaving because staying would admit a kind of failure nobody wants to discuss at staff call. He folded the graph that showed Naples rising like a tide and slid it into his diary where private sentences lived. On the road he took one last set of reports from the net that had become a kind of conscience. Ducks cycling in the rain, ambulances maintaining schedules that read like promises kept, rail yards turning cars with a speed that suggested someone took pride in friction defeated, delousing stations quiet and efficient in a week that should have seen fever. The detail that bothered him most was not a number, but a voice, a nurse translating orders into reassurance with a patience he could not weaponize. Propaganda had asked him to imagine barbarism. The intercepts offered bureaucracy with a human face. He wrote 2 lines and shut the book, not beaten by tanks, beaten by everything. Huberman, miles south and a universe away, wrote his own note on a scrap. The shelter mother had returned with Libera for a check, and Bianchi had laughed at the MP's careful Italian. The baby's weight had notched upward in the ledger in the way victory does when it becomes personal, a number with a heartbeat. Ames, on the quay, took delivery of a portable crane that looked like a prank until it lifted its first ton and everyone stopped joking. The Liberty ship heaved a farewell that rattled windows and reminded the city it had a future measured in departures and arrivals, not disasters. When a squadron of fighter bombers buzzed the road north of Naples, Weiss watched them pass through a gap in the clouds like precise anger, then disappear. He thought of fuel again, always fuel, and how the enemy had it as a birthright. He was not a coward, and the men he served alongside were not fools. They would fight northward the way men fight when the balance has tipped, but the order remains. At the checkpoint, he showed his papers and received a nod that acknowledged only process. Behind him, Naples kept breathing. In front of him, the map narrowed into mountains and words like casino. He did not look back. The ward windows admitted a brightness too honest to be winter. Bianchi held Libera as if she were issuing a citation, ceremonious and practical. Huberman received the bundle with the clumsiness of a man whose hands had learned more uses than he had expected. Berkowski, at the door with his cap cocked, pretended to police the moment and failed on purpose. Someone produced a camera that clicked with the solemnity of a gavel. Later, the caption would read, "GI's aid stalk," and the photograph would travel farther than any convoy. For now, it was only people in a room who had chosen to keep each other alive. The ledger's voice murmured in the background, like a good engine at idle. Naples still pushed towards 7,000 tons a day. Ducks still shouldered loads that ignored the argument of ruined piers. Ambulances still ferried bodies and hopes with the confidence that comes from having more than enough of both machine and fuel. Factories a continent away continued their indifferent miracles. Amphibious trucks produced in the tens of thousands, ambulances past 26,000, jeeps in the neighbourhood of 647,000. The impossible statistic, if you wanted one to close the ledger on, lived not in a single digit, but in comparison. A free nation manufacturing so many vehicles and so much trust that one city's health campaign could process hundreds of thousands while sustaining an army's advance, mercy and momentum in the same crate. Bianchi corrected a visitor gently when the word prisoner slipped into a question about the mothers in line. Civilians, she said, under Allied administration, attended like patients, not guarded like captives. The rumour had its uses for fear. The truth had its uses for victory. Huberman, who kept the ragged strip of his MP armband folded in his kit, did not argue doctrine. He offered his seat and fetched water with the unconscious courtesy soldiers learn when they are tired of shouting. Outside, gulls rehearsed their own war over a glistening scrap. In the alley, a jeep clattered past, then two, then three, so common now that nobody bothered to look. Weiss, farther north in weather that did not like decisions, opened his diary and found the folded graph again. He did not tear it up. He wrote a single sentence beneath it and closed the book as if shelving a future. The war ends when their numbers stop moving. In Naples, the numbers moved like breath. Ames signed off on another crane, another string of rail cars, another day of ducks that laughed at the edge between water and land. Bianchi tucked Libera back into a blanket stamped US, a flag disguised as comfort. The camera clicked once more. Outside, the harbour answered with a deep-throated vow that sounded, to a city learning to trust it, exactly like tomorrow.